That morning, the Oregon beach should have been empty, but the veteran Everett Kane's German Shepherd, Bandit, froze, his body rigid. He wasn't looking at his owner, he was staring into the dense fog bank offshore. He wasn't barking, he was growling, a deep territorial warning. Everett, a man with 20 years in the Navy, knew that no animal reacts to fog. As he stepped forward, a massive silhouette began to emerge, unlike anything he had ever seen. It wasn't a ship, it was a custom-built fortress, a mangled hybrid of metal, and it was drifting lifelessly. Everett knew instantly, whatever had built it and whatever had happened to it was no ordinary accident. Please support us by subscribing to the channel to uncover the real mystery behind the vessel, the Nomad. The air in Osprey Point, Oregon, carried a unique scent, salt, pine, and the damp metallic chill of a storm that had just passed. The sky was a pale, exhausted gray, and the Pacific Ocean, usually roaring, was reduced to a tired, rhythmic sigh against the shore. The storm had scoured the beach, leaving it littered with an offering of tangled kelp, shattered crab pots, and driftwood worn as smooth as bone. This was the calm after, a silence that always felt heavier and more profound than the storm itself. For Everett Kane, it was a familiar quiet, one that mirrored the stillness he had spent the last decade trying to build inside himself. He had moved to Osprey Point specifically for this isolation, for the predictable rhythm of the tides and the buffer of the dense fog-shrouded forest at his back. The Navy had given him enough noise and chaos to last a lifetime. Everett walked the debris line, his head down, his gaze scanning the sand. He was a tall man, lean in a way that spoke of resilience rather than frailty. His brown hair, long enough to brush the collar of his jacket, was heavily streaked with silver at the temples. His face was a map of past hardships, rugged and weathered, but the lines around his eyes hinted at a kindness he rarely had the occasion to show. A heavy graying stubble covered his jaw, blurring the line between intention and neglect. He wore his uniform for the cold Oregon coast, an old unzipped brown leather jacket that had long ago molded to his frame, revealing a thick plaid flannel shirt beneath it, a familiar pattern of bright red, dark navy, and white. His faded blue jeans were tucked into sturdy, waterproof work boots that left deep, solitary tracks in the wet sand. Trotting just ahead of him, his nose working overtime, was Bandit. Bandit was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, though his coloring was unique. He was not the standard black and tan. His coat was a striking wolf-like mix of silver gray and patches of brilliant white. He was a large dog, powerful and alert, but his temperament was steady. Bandit was Everett's shadow, a loyal and intelligent presence that anchored the man to the present. He was the one living thing that Everett allowed to get close, the one being whose demands, a walk, a meal, a scratch behind the ears, were a comfort, not a burden. This morning, Bandit's energy was different. The storm had unsettled the world, and the dog could smell the disturbance. He zigzagged across the beach, sniffing intently at the piles of seaweed, his plumed tail lower than usual. Everett stopped to look at a large piece of gnarled cypress, considering it for his wood stove, when Bandit suddenly froze. The dog's head snapped toward the water, his ears perked forward, rigid. He was perfectly still, a statue of muscle and fur. A low, uncertain whine rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Everett asked, his voice a low gravel, rough from disuse. Bandit didn't look back. He took 2 stiff-legged steps toward the surf, his gaze locked on the dense bank of fog that still clung to the water's edge, obscuring the horizon. He let out a sharp, resonant bark. It wasn't his rabbit bark or his delivery truck at the driveway bark. This was new. This was a bark of profound confusion. "Easy," Everett said, moving to place a hand on the dog's neck. Bandit's muscles were tense, coiled. Then he barked again, a series of urgent, percussive sounds that cut through the morning quiet. He lunged forward, not playfully, but with purpose, looking back at Everett with wide, insistent eyes. He barked at the fog. "All right, I'm coming," Everett muttered, his curiosity piqued. He trusted the dog implicitly. Bandit didn't panic over nothing. Everett followed, his boots sinking into the saturated sand near the waterline. Bandit was pulling now, insistent, leading him toward a section of the beach where the fog was thickest. "What have you found, huh? More junk from the storm?" The fog swirled, pushed by a breeze that hadn't been there a moment before. It parted like a curtain. Everett stopped dead. His breath caught in his chest. Bandit fell silent, pressing against Everett's leg, sensing the sudden absolute stillness in his owner. It wasn't driftwood. It wasn't a capsized fishing boat. It wasn't a whale. It was massive. A structure, dark and angular, was wallowing in the shallows, listing heavily to one side. It was half-submerged, battered relentlessly by the incoming surf. The waves crashed against its side with a dull, heavy thud of water against metal and wood. It was wrong. It didn't belong in this world, let alone on this beach. It looked less like a boat and more like a piece of a building that had been sheared off and dropped into the ocean. It was a bizarre, grotesque hybrid of a mobile home, a shipping container, and some kind of homemade science experiment. Panels of metal, some painted, some rusted, were bolted together at odd angles. Everett could see what looked like the curved aluminum shell of a salvaged Airstream trailer bolted to a makeshift hull of plywood and fiberglass. Thick black sealant, like tar, had been slathered over the seams. On its flat roof, an array of solar panels lay shattered, their crystalline structures glittering uselessly. A small, wind-powered turbine, its blades snapped off, hung limply from a metal mast. It was a monument to a desperate, failed ingenuity. The quiet, reclusive man on the beach vanished. In his place stood Petty Officer Everett Kane, United States Navy. His eyes scanned the object, a practiced, analytical gaze that had been drilled into him for years. This was not a registered vessel. It was custom-built, dangerously so. It had no proper hull shape, no keel to speak of, which explained why it was wallowing so pitifully in the surf. "It's a boat," Everett said, his voice barely a whisper. Or it was supposed to be. He waded a few feet into the freezing water, the cold biting at his legs through the denim. Bandit whined at his heels, splashing nervously. "Stay," Everett commanded. The word was sharp, and Bandit reluctantly obeyed, pacing the water's edge. Everett got closer. The thing was heavily damaged, but the damage looked old. This wasn't just from last night's storm. The rust was deep. The wood was waterlogged to the point of disintegration. This vessel had been adrift for a long, long time. He put his hand on the cold, slick hull. He felt a vibration, the groaning of a structure in its death throes. He moved along its length, searching for any sign of life. A name, a home port. There was nothing, just the chaos of its construction. He shouted, his voice cracking the silence, a voice trained to carry over the roar of engines and ocean. "Ahoy! Is anyone aboard?" Only the sound of the waves answered, sucking at the sand around his feet. He saw no lights, no modern navigation equipment, no life raft. There was only silence and the smell of rust and rot. This was a derelict, a ghost ship, a failed dream that the ocean had finally, violently spit out. And as the fog cleared further, revealing the full, desperate, and impossible shape of the vessel, Everett Kane felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the water soaking his jeans. He had seen the ocean swallow many things, good ships, good men, but he had never seen it deliver something quite like this. Everett Kane took 2 involuntary steps back, the icy water of the Pacific sloshing over the tops of his boots. Bandit, sensing his owner's abrupt tension, let out a low, uneasy growl. "No, boy, heel," Everett commanded, his voice tight. Bandit retreated from the surf, whining, but obeyed, staying close to Everett's left leg. The man's mind, usually a quiet place he kept locked down, was now operating with cold, rapid-fire precision. His Navy training screamed at him. A civilian might be tempted to climb aboard, driven by curiosity. Everett was driven by a deep, ingrained knowledge of everything that could go wrong. The vessel was groaning, a terrible sound of metal and wood flexing under the relentless pressure of the waves. It was unstable. It could roll, trapping anyone foolish enough to be near it. It could have submerged hazards, jagged metal, broken lines, hidden just below the murky water. Then there was the unseen. A derelict vessel often meant leaking fluids. Diesel, hydraulic oil, battery acid. And worst of all, it could be a trap. While unlikely here in Osprey Point, his training always accounted for the worst-case scenario. But this wasn't just about immediate danger. This was about jurisdiction. This was not a job for the local police. This was not a lost and found item. This vessel, unidentified and washed ashore from the sea, fell under the absolute, unquestioned authority of the United States Coast Guard. Everett knew the protocol as well as he knew his own name. He had worked with the Coast Guard countless times during his service. He turned his back on the wreck and marched up the beach to the dry sand, Bandit pacing anxiously beside him. He pulled his cell phone from the inner pocket of his leather jacket. His fingers felt thick and numb, partly from the cold, partly from the adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. He shielded the screen from the gray light, his thumb finding the number he still knew by heart for the regional station. He dialed. It rang twice. Coast Guard Station, Tillamook Bay. Duty officer speaking. The voice was young, alert, and professional. "This is Everett Kane," Everett said, his own voice sounding foreign to him, stripped of all emotion. "I am reporting a derelict vessel, washed ashore. I am approximately 2 miles south of the Osprey Point main beach access, just below Haystack Rock." There was a quiet tapping of a keyboard on the other end. "Copy that, Mr. Kane. Can you describe the vessel?" "Negative. It is a non-standard construction. Custom built, looks like a hybrid of a trailer and a makeshift hull. Heavily damaged, appears to have been in the water for a significant time. It is currently unstable in the surf." "Are there any signs of life? Anyone aboard?" "I have hailed the vessel." "No response," Everett said. "No visible signs of life. I have not attempted to board." "Good," the voice said, the approval clear. "Are there any visible pollutants? An oil slick? Leaking fuel?" Everett scanned the water around the wreck. "Negative. No visible sheen." "Understood. We know your location, Mr. Kane. I am dispatching a response team. Officer Julian Reed will be the one meeting you. Can you remain on site until they arrive?" ETA is approximately 20 minutes. "I'll be here," Everett said and ended the call. He sat down on a large bleached log, the same one he and Bandit often rested on. The tension of the call dissipated, leaving a familiar, sour taste in his mouth. He hated this. He hated the intrusion. He had moved to this foggy, isolated town precisely to be left alone, to escape the world of uniforms, procedures, and emergencies. And now the ocean had delivered one directly to his doorstep. Bandit, sensing the shift in his owner, nudged his cold nose under Everett's hand. Everett began to absent-mindedly stroke the dog's thick ruff, his gaze fixed on the impossible, broken thing in the water. "Just had to find it, didn't you, boy?" he murmured. Bandit just leaned in closer, a solid, warm presence against the cold morning. True to the duty officer's word, exactly 19 minutes later, the distant sound of a heavy-duty engine reached them. A white U.S. Coast Guard pickup truck, its lights flashing silently, rolled off the access road and onto the hard-packed sand. It came to a stop a respectful distance from Everett. A man stepped out of the driver's side. He was younger than Everett, maybe in his late 20s, with a lean, athletic build. He wore the dark blue Coast Guard uniform, the jacket zipped high against the wind. He had short, neat-cut hair and a focused, professional demeanor. "Mr. Kane?" the man called out, walking toward him. Everett stood up, brushing the sand from his jeans. "That's me." "Officer Julian Reed," the man said, offering a gloved hand, which Everett shook. Reed's eyes immediately went from Everett to the wreck, and his professional mask slipped for just a second. A low, impressed whistle escaped his lips. "You weren't kidding. Non-standard." "She's all yours, officer," Everett said, stepping back, already ceding control. "Appreciate the call, especially the part where you didn't try to play hero and go on board." Reed's team, 2 more members in utility gear, were already exiting the truck. They began unspooling a long line of yellow "Do Not Cross" tape, establishing a wide perimeter around the wreck, with Everett and Bandit now squarely on the outside. The protocol was swift. Officer Reed and another team member, now in waterproof gear, moved in. They didn't speak, just used hand signals. They approached the vessel from opposite sides, testing its stability with long poles, checking the way the water moved around it. "She's grounded solid for now," Reed called out. "But the tide's coming in. We've got a window." Reed was the one to board. He found a spot where the hull had been breached and hauled himself up. He disappeared inside the dark, bizarre structure for several minutes that felt to Everett like hours. Bandit whined, sensing the tension. Everett watched, his old training making him a critical observer. He watched the set of the vessel, how it reacted to Reed's weight, how the waves were beginning to lift it more aggressively. Finally, Reed emerged, standing on the tilted roof. He looked down at his team on the beach and shook his head, a clear negative. He shouted against the wind, "Vessel is clear. No persons on board? No immediate hazmat?" The sense of relief was immediate, even in Everett. No bodies. That was a small mercy. The situation changed instantly. The search and rescue phase was over. Now it was salvage and investigation. Reed's team began working on a plan to tow it. But first, he got on his radio. 20 minutes later, a different vehicle pulled up. A standard-issue SUV from the Osprey Point Sheriff's Department. The man who stepped out was the physical opposite of the Coast Guard officer. He was in his mid-50s, with a heavy-set frame that his uniform seemed to be losing a battle with. He had a graying mustache and the weary, patient eyes of a man who had seen every small-town problem imaginable. This was Sheriff Nathan. He trudged across the sand, nodding to Reed. "Julian, you find a body?" "Negative, Nathan," Reed said, stripping off his gloves. "She's empty. No fuel, no bodies, no ID. Just a whole lot of junk. We're going to tow it to the harbor, but it's officially your problem now. It's property." Sheriff Nathan sighed, a long, mournful sound. He looked at the wreck. "Great, just what I needed. More paperwork." His gaze drifted over and landed on Everett and Bandit. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Everett," Nathan said. It wasn't a question. "Figures you'd be the one to find it. You can't just have a quiet walk, can you?" Everett gave a single, non-committal nod. He hated this. He was the center of attention, the witness. "All right," Reed said, his part of the transaction complete. "We'll get this thing floating and haul it to the harbor. Sheriff, it's all yours." Sheriff Nathan turned his full attention to Everett, pulling a small notebook from his breast pocket. "Well, Everett, I'm going to need a formal statement. Let's start from the beginning. What time did your dog find this thing?" Everett Kane looked at the wreck, then at the sheriff, then at the Coast Guard officers. The quiet, invisible life he had built for himself had just been breached, as surely as the hull of the ghost ship. He was involved. "Bandit," he corrected the sheriff, his voice low. "His name is Bandit, and it started this morning, just after dawn. It took the rest of the morning." The arrival of the Coast Guard's heavy-duty cutter, followed by the town's largest mobile crane, usually reserved for lifting fishing boats with seized engines, had turned the Osprey Point harbor into a public spectacle. Fishermen, mending nets on their own decks, stopped work to watch. Locals who had heard the rumors spreading like wildfire gathered at the far end of the dock, kept back by Sheriff Nathan's perimeter tape. Everett Kane stood apart from them all, near his truck, with Bandit sitting faithfully at his heel. He hated the attention. He hated the whispers. He just wanted to go home. But Sheriff Nathan had been insistent. "You found it, Everett. I need you to stick around. You saw it before anyone else, besides the Coast Guard." So he waited, his arms crossed over his chest, his leather jacket feeling too thin in the damp public air. The operation to lift the wreck was slow and fraught with difficulty. The vessel, which the Coast Guard had officially logged as the Nomad after finding the name crudely painted on its stern, did not want to cooperate. It was a dead weight, full of water, snagged on the rocks it had washed over. Finally, with a loud, groaning shriek of tortured metal, the crane's engine whined in protest, and the Nomad lifted free of the water. It hung in the air, dripping seawater and seaweed, spinning slowly. And in the full gray light of day, the contradiction that Everett had sensed on the beach became shockingly clear. The vessel was a ruin, yes, dented, breached, and battered. But the summary had been right. Beneath the damage, the workmanship of the hull itself was incredible. This was not the work of an amateur with a hammer. The welds along the steel frame were clean and precise. The design, though bizarre, was complex, showing a deep understanding of structural integrity. The salvaged Airstream trailer hadn't just been bolted on, it had been integrated, reinforced with a custom-built exoskeleton. He was a brilliant engineer, Everett said, not realizing he'd spoken aloud. Sheriff Nathan, standing nearby, grunted. A brilliant engineer who built a boat that sinks. No, Everett countered, his voice quiet but firm. He built a fortress. He just didn't know how to sail it. The crane carefully, painstakingly, lowered the vessel onto a roped-off section of the concrete dock. It settled with a deep, hollow sound, water pouring from its open wounds. It looked like a beached whale, alien and tragic. Sheriff Nathan cut the perimeter tape and motioned for Everett. "All right, Kane, you're the Navy man. You're coming with me. Just watch where you step." Everett nodded, giving Bandit's ears a quick rub. "Stay?" Bandit whined, his eyes fixed on Everett, but he sat, trembling slightly, but obedient. The moment they stepped through the breached hatch, the stench hit them. It was a thick, gagging smell of mildew, spoiled food, diesel fumes, and the profound, briny rot of the deep ocean. The submarine's total disaster was an understatement. The interior was a scene of complete and utter chaos. If the outside had shown engineering skill, the inside showed the ocean's raw, indifferent power. Everything was destroyed. A navigation console, which looked to have been custom-built with multiple screens, was a mess of shattered glass and waterlogged, corroded wiring. A single cot was bolted to the floor, its mattress soaked and torn open, spilling its guts. A small galley kitchen was unrecognizable. Cabinets had been torn from their hinges, and a layer of dark, foul-smelling silt covered everything. In the small engine compartment, the machinery was a solid block of bright orange rust. "Holy," Sheriff Nathan muttered, pulling a handkerchief over his nose and mouth. "This thing's been adrift for months, maybe a year." He pulled out a small camera and began taking photos, the flash illuminating the damp, dark ruin. "Anything," Nathan said, his voice muffled. "A logbook, an ID, anything that tells me who this guy was." He kicked at a pile of debris, revealing nothing. "Looks like a total loss." The ocean stripped it bare. Everett, however, was scanning the room with a different set of eyes. He was looking at the construction, at the way the bulkheads were designed. He saw the same contradiction. Brilliant, reinforced steel ribs holding up flimsy particle board shelving that had disintegrated. He had been inside for less than 5 minutes when a sharp, punctuated bark sounded from the dock. Sheriff Nathan flinched. "What now?" Everett looked back. Bandit was on his feet, straining against the invisible "stay" command, his nose pointed right at the wreck. He barked again, not a warning bark, but one of pure, frustrated insistence. "He's not usually like this," Everett said, a prickle of unease running down his neck. "Probably just smells the rot, or a rat," Nathan said, turning his attention back to the console. Everett stepped back out onto the dock. "What is it, boy?" Bandit ran to him, licked his hand, and then immediately ran back to the spot on the dock closest to the vessel, whining and looking from the wreck back to Everett. "All right," Everett said, his trust in the dog absolute. He clipped Bandit's leash to his collar. "You want to help? You help." He led the dog to the hatch. Bandit, normally fearless, hesitated at the threshold, sniffing the overwhelming stench. "Okay, easy. Come on." Everett led him inside. Bandit was a different creature in the enclosed space. His claws made small, sharp clicking sounds on the wet metal floor. He ignored the obvious debris, his nose working furiously, quartering the small cabin. Sheriff Nathan watched, looking skeptical but intrigued. "He's not a canine, Everett," Nathan said. "He's smart," Everett replied simply. Bandit moved past the galley, past the cot. He went to the far wall of the cabin, a curved metal bulkhead that was clearly part of the original Airstream trailer. The wall had been warped, bent inward, likely by a massive wave. Bandit stopped. He sniffed. The low whine started deep in his chest, and then he began to scratch. The sound of the dog's claws on the metal was loud in the small space. "Hey, easy, Bandit," Nathan said. What's he doing?" Bandit was focused, digging at the base of the warped panel, his gray and white fur bristling. Everett put his hand on the dog's back. "Heel." Bandit ignored him, scratching harder. "Sheriff," Everett said, his voice quiet. "He's got something." "It's a bent wall, Kane. It's probably a rat's nest, like I said, or just trapped water." "He wouldn't be this insistent," Everett said. He pushed the dog back gently. "Stay." This time, Bandit obeyed, but he sat vibrating, his eyes locked on the spot. Everett ran his hands along the warped metal. It was solid, but it was clearly buckled. Something had pushed it inward, creating a small, hollow space behind it. "You got that crowbar from the truck?" Everett asked. Sheriff Nathan looked at the wall, then at the dog, then at Everett. He sighed. "Why not? This day can't get any weirder." He went to fetch it. When he returned, Everett took the heavy steel bar. He found a seam where the metal panel met the floor. He wedged the tip in and pushed. The metal groaned but didn't budge. "Stand back," Everett said. He repositioned, planting his feet. He put his full weight into it, the muscles in his back and shoulders straining under the plaid shirt. There was a loud, protesting shriek of metal, and the seam popped open. Everett worked the bar up the frame, prying, his face set in concentration. The panel bent, folded, and finally peeled back, revealing the damp, dark insulation and framework behind it. "Well, I'll be," Sheriff Nathan said, shining his flashlight into the gap. There, wedged deep into the insulation, safe from the chaos that had destroyed the rest of the cabin, was a small, black, waterproof box. It was the kind of case used for high-end cameras or delicate electronics, built to withstand pressure and water. Everett reached his hand into the dark, cold space. His fingers brushed against the hard plastic. He pulled it out. It was about the size of a lunchbox, and it was heavy. He stood up, holding the box, water dripping from his arm. Sheriff Nathan just stared. He actually found something. Everett looked down at his dog. Bandit was sitting quietly, his tongue lolling in a brief, satisfied pant. Everett reached down and put his hand on Bandit's head, scratching the thick fur behind his ears. "Good boy," Everett whispered. "Good boy." Sheriff Nathan held the heavy, waterproof box like it was an unexploded ordnance. He looked at the wreck, then at Everett, then at the box. "Well, Kane," he said, his voice heavy with the weariness of a man who just inherited a mountain of paperwork. "Since your dog is apparently the star witness, you'd better come with me." He jerked his head toward his SUV. "I'll even buy you a cup of that sludge we call coffee. You're going to be here a while." Everett looked back at his truck, where Bandit sat watching, a statue of patient loyalty. "The dog stays with me," Nathan sighed. "He can't come in the station, Everett. You know that. But he'll be fine in your truck in the lot." This was the part Everett hated, the compromise, the rules of a world he tried to keep at arm's length. He walked back to his truck, opened the passenger door, and Bandit hopped in, settling into the worn seat. "Stay," Everett said, his voice softer now. "I'll be back." Bandit let out a single, low whine, pressing his nose to the window, but he obeyed. The Osprey Point Sheriff's Department was a small brick building that smelled of stale coffee, damp raincoats, and old paper files. It was cramped, lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that made everyone look tired. Everett felt the walls close in on him the moment he stepped inside. He was a man of open air and ocean horizons. This was his personal cage. He refused the coffee and stood near the doorway while Sheriff Nathan placed the black case on his cluttered desk. "Let's see what the ocean decided to give us," Nathan muttered. He pulled a thick-bladed utility knife from his belt and carefully worked the tip into the latches, which were stiff with salt and corrosion. With a final twist, the latches popped open with a distinct, pressurized hiss, as if the box was exhaling a breath it had held for a long time. Nathan lifted the lid. The smell of mildew and preserved plastic wafted out. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, were two items. The first was a thick black spiral-bound notebook, its cover swollen and warped. The second was a smaller, clear plastic case, like the one Everett used for his fishing lures. Sheriff Nathan, now wearing a pair of nitrile gloves, carefully lifted the notebook. It was heavy with retained moisture. The first dozen pages were a solid block of mildewed, fused paper, completely illegible. "Well, that's a bust," Nathan said, his disappointment clear. "Wait," Everett said, moving a step closer. "Look at the core." Nathan, intrigued by the observation, carefully peeled the ruined outer layer back. The pages underneath, near the spiral's center, were protected. The paper was still damp, but the ink, a dark, permanent black, had held. It was not the looping cursive of a casual sailor. It was precise, mechanical block lettering, as if written by a machine. On the first clean page at the top was a title: Project Nomad, Log 001, and beneath it, a name, Simon Caldwell. "Simon Caldwell," Nathan said, rolling the name over. "Why does that sound familiar?" He moved to his ancient desktop computer, the fans whirring loudly. He typed the name into a search engine, the clacking of the keyboard filling the quiet office. Everett watched over his shoulder. The search results populated instantly, not with local fishermen or missing persons reports, but with articles from national tech journals and business magazines. "Well, I'll be," Nathan whispered, clicking the first link. The man in the photo was not a rugged mariner. He was thin, intense, with sharp features and the kind of eyes that seemed to be looking at a problem no one else could see. He was a wunderkind, a genius software engineer who had made a fortune in the early 2000s designing complex logistical systems for shipping companies. Then, 5 years ago, he had vanished. "He just dropped off the face of the earth," Nathan said, scrolling. "Sold his company, liquidated his assets, and disappeared." "Why?" Everett asked, his voice a low rumble. Nathan scrolled down, his face growing somber. He found an older article from 2020. "Oh, here's why." He turned the screen so Everett could read it. The headline spoke of a personal tragedy. Simon Caldwell's wife and 8-year-old daughter had passed away from complications during a routine surgery, a catastrophic, 1 in a million medical error. "He sued the hospital," Nathan read, summarizing. "He sued the pharmaceutical company. He lost. The system protected itself." The last article about him was from a press conference on the courthouse steps. Caldwell, looking gaunt, his suit hanging off him, wasn't grieving. He was raging. He hadn't just spoken of his loss. He had spoken of a failed, corrupt system and a society built on flawed logic. "I will not participate in a system that values profit over life," he had said. "I will not be governed by a society that cannot even protect its own. I will build my own." And then he was gone. A heavy silence filled the office. Everett felt an uncomfortable, dangerous flicker of understanding. He knew what it was like to be betrayed by a system you trusted. He knew what it was like to want to disappear. "So he built that thing," Nathan said, gesturing back toward the harbor. He looked at the second item in the box, the small, clear plastic case. Inside was a single, black USB drive. Nathan looked at Everett, then called to a back room. "Deputy Miles, get in here. Bring the sandbox laptop." A young deputy, barely old enough to shave, hurried in, carrying a heavy-duty laptop. "Sheriff? What's—" "Whoa." He saw the box. "This is from the wreck. I need you to check it." "Safely," Nathan ordered. Deputy Miles carefully took the USB drive and plugged it into the sandbox, a laptop not connected to their network, designed to safely analyze suspicious files. The screen lit up. The drive was not locked. It was not encrypted. It was, in fact, obsessively organized. The drive contained dozens of folders. Blueprints, hydroponics, water filtration, power systems, video logs, and a single solitary text file at the top of the directory, Manifesto. "Go ahead," Nathan said, his voice grim. Miles clicked the text file. The screen filled with the same precise mechanical text as the logbook. It was not the ranting of a madman. It was the cold, passionate, logical treatise of a genius. "The system on land is flawed," it began. "It is built on a foundation of compromise, greed, and catastrophic inefficiency. It is a house built on rotting wood. The storm is coming, and it will collapse. The system failed my family. It will fail yours. I will not wait for the collapse. I will build its successor." Everett read the words, captivated against his will. Simon Caldwell hadn't just built a boat. "The Nomad," the manifesto continued, "is not an escape. It is a prototype. It is a fully self-sufficient, mobile, independent floating oasis. It is designed to survive what the land cannot. It will run on sun, on wind, and on pure, uncorrupted logic. A new society, a new way, starting with one." "Open a video," Everett said, his voice hoarse. Miles navigated to the video logs folder. The first file was dated almost 4 years ago. He clicked it. The video flickered to life. A man, recognizable as Simon Caldwell but healthier, his eyes bright with a fervent, almost holy fire, stood in a massive workshop. Behind him, the bare, skeletal frame of the Nomad was visible. "Log 001, Simon said, his voice crisp and clear. "The hull framework is complete. The system is viable. The mainland is a memory. From this point forward, only the project matters." He was brilliant. He was obsessed. He was alone. And as Everett Kane stood in the cramped sheriff's office, with Bandit waiting patiently in the truck, he felt a profound, chilling connection to the man. The ocean hadn't just delivered a wreck. It had delivered the ghost of a man who, like Everett, had tried to build a fortress against the world, only to be consumed by it. The small, fluorescent-lit office at the sheriff's department felt suffocating. Everett Kane had spent the last hour shifting his weight, standing by the door, his arms crossed. He felt a desperate need to be outside, to feel the cold, clean air and the solid, silent presence of his dog. On the desk, the deputy, Miles, was still navigating the digital ghost of Simon Caldwell. "There are more video files," the young man said, his voice hushed. "These are different. They're not in the workshop." "Play them," Sheriff Nathan ordered, his voice grim. Miles clicked the file labeled Log 004, Sea Trial, Saw 1. The screen flickered, and suddenly they were no longer in the dark, salvaged wreck. They were on the deck of the Nomad, as it was meant to be. The sun was brilliant, painfully bright, reflecting off a body of water as flat and blue as a sheet of glass. Simon Caldwell was on screen, his thin face alive with a triumphant, almost manic energy. He wore new, expensive-looking sailing gear. "Sea Trial Day 1, Simon said to the camera, his voice crisp. "We are underway in the Santa Barbara Channel. All systems are performing nominally." He turned the camera to a custom-built dashboard, a bank of glowing blue and green readouts. "Power plant efficiency is at 99%, he narrated, tapping a screen. "Desalination unit is fully functional, producing 20 gallons per hour. Hull stress sensors are reading 0.03. The data is perfect." Sheriff Nathan grunted. "Looks like it's working." Everett said nothing. His jaw was tight. His eyes weren't on the glowing screens. They were on the horizon. The water. "Click the next one," Everett said, his voice a low command. Miles, startled by Everett's tone, quickly opened the next file. Log 007, swell test. The scene was slightly different. The water was choppy now, perhaps 2-foot swells, the kind a small fishing boat would barely notice. The Nomad was handling it, but the movement was awkward, a jerky rocking motion. Simon was paler, gripping a handrail, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. But his eyes were still glued to his dashboard. "Encountering 2-foot swells," he said, his voice strained but determined. "The dynamic stabilization model is performing at 98% efficiency. The data is solid." Everett felt a chill so cold it was almost painful. It started in his gut and spread to his limbs. Sheriff Nathan looked over. "What is it, Kane? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," Everett whispered. He pointed a finger at the screen, at the man who was so focused on his numbers. "He's going to die," Everett said. Nathan and Miles both stared at him. "What do you mean?" Nathan asked. "He says the data is solid." "The data's solid, but the boat's wrong," Everett said, the words coming out in a rush, his 20 years of Navy experience surfacing like a breaking wave. "Look at it. He's in the Santa Barbara Channel. It's a protected waterway. It's a lake. He's not reading the sea, Sheriff. He's reading his computer. That's not a sea trial." He walked closer to the desk, his voice filling with a pained, urgent authority. "That thing is a death trap. It's top-heavy, dangerously so. That entire array of solar panels? It's not a power source. It's a sail. A giant, solid sail, mounted high. The windage on it is massive. The first real crosswind, the first real 20-foot swell in the North Pacific. She'll roll, and she will never, ever come back up." He tapped the screen where Simon was smiling, proud of his 98% efficiency. "He's a brilliant engineer, but he's not a sailor. He thinks the ocean is a data set, a problem he can solve with math." The last video file was just 3 seconds of garbled static, a digital scream, and then blackness. The room was silent. Deputy Miles looked physically ill. Sheriff Nathan just stroked his mustache, his face grim. "I need some air," Everett said abruptly, and he turned and left the office, pushing through the door into the gray afternoon. He went to his truck. The moment Bandit saw him, the dog stood, his tail giving a single, hopeful wag. Everett opened the door, and the dog leaped out. Everett clipped on his leash, and for 10 minutes he just walked, letting Bandit sniff the perimeter of the small building. The simple, physical act of holding the leash, of feeling the dog's steady pull, was the only thing that kept the chill at bay. He let Bandit drink from a water bottle he kept in the truck, his large hand gentle on the dog's gray and white ruff. The dog's needs were simple, real: water, a walk, loyalty. Simon Caldwell's needs were abstract: data, logic, a new world. Everett went back inside, leaving Bandit secure in the truck. The office was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the sound of Nathan's voice, patient and frustrated on the phone. "Yes, Santa Barbara. That's right, a silver Airstream trailer on top of a—" "I know it sounds crazy. Just check your logs." "Yes, I'll hold." Nathan spent the next 2 hours on the phone. He was methodical, working his way from the harbormaster's office in Santa Barbara to local boatyards, to the local Coast Guard station. Everett sat in a hard plastic chair by the wall, a silent observer drawn into the vortex of the mystery. Finally, Nathan sat up straighter. "You do?" Yes, I understand. Do you have a name?" He scribbled on his notepad. "Wyatt Monroe. You got a number for him?" "I do, thank you." Nathan hung up and looked at Everett. "Got a hit. Harbormaster in Santa Barbara. Remembers the vessel. Caused a huge headache. Illegally moored. Refused to communicate, but he gave me the name of an old-timer who supposedly tried to talk to him. A Mr. Wyatt Monroe." Nathan dialed the new number and, after a moment, pushed the button for the speakerphone. The line clicked. "Yeah?" The voice was like gravel rolling in a tide, slow, old, and rough. "Mr. Wyatt Monroe? Who's asking?" "This is Sheriff Nathan from Osprey Point, Oregon. I'm calling about a man named Simon Caldwell. He was driving a very unusual boat. Looked like a trailer." There was a long, static-filled pause. Then a dry, humorless chuckle crackled through the speaker. "Well, I'll be. You found it, did you, Sheriff?" "'Bout time. Knew the ocean would spit that thing out sooner or later. Just hoping it'd be in one piece." "You spoke with him, Mr. Monroe?" Nathan asked, leaning forward. "Sure did," Wyatt's voice said. "He was docked a few slips down from me. Watched him working on it, all computers and wires. I went over. I'm 74 years old, Sheriff. I've been on this water since 1973. I've seen 'em all. I know boats." Everett sat up. "What did you tell him, Mr. Monroe?" "I told him what I saw. I said, 'Son, I don't know what you're building, but it's not a boat. It's a box. You're top-heavy, you got no real freeboard, and that square stern is going to get swamped by the first following sea.' I asked him what his plan was for a rogue wave. You know what he told me?" "What's that?" "He said his hydrodynamic models showed rogue waves were a statistical anomaly he didn't need to account for." Wyatt gave another dry laugh. He was polite, but he looked at me like I was the fool, like I was some old fossil who didn't understand his shiny new world. What was the last thing you said to him?" Nathan asked, his pen tapping the desk. The line was quiet for a moment. When Wyatt spoke again, the humor was gone, replaced by a deep coastal sadness. I told him, "Son, I've seen a lot of things go to sea. That thing you built, it looks more like a coffin than a boat." I told him he was just building his own coffin. A heavy silence filled the office. Everett Kane closed his eyes. "And what did he say?" Nathan finally asked. He just nodded, smiled. That's the part that got me. He smiled and said, "Thank you for your input, Mr. Monroe, but the data is solid." And he went right back to his wiring, left in the middle of the night, a few months back, never saw him again. Nathan thanked the old fisherman and hung up the phone. The clack of the receiver was loud in the small room. "The data is solid," Nathan repeated, shaking his head. "The data was wrong," Everett said, his voice barely a whisper. "The ocean doesn't care about data." Sheriff Nathan looked exhausted. The day's events had piled on top of a career's worth of small-town dramas, and this was different. He ran a hand over his face, his gaze falling on the black waterproof box, now officially evidence. "Look, Kane," he said, his voice gravelly. "I'm done for the night. But you understood what that old man Wyatt was saying. You understood what you were seeing in those videos. I'm just a cop. You're a sailor." Everett said nothing, his posture rigid by the door, his desire to leave a palpable force in the room. Nathan picked up the small USB drive, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. "I'm logging the box and the notebook, but this," he held the drive out to Everett. "Take it home. Go through the rest of those files. The blueprints, the technical logs. I need to know what you, as an expert, think. I need to know if Simon Caldwell just built a bad boat or if something else happened. See if his data makes any sense to you." Everett looked at the drive. It was the last thing he wanted. It was an anchor pulling him back into a world he had escaped. But it was also an order, wrapped in a request. A problem that, like Simon's, needed to be solved. He took the drive, its plastic casing feeling heavy in his palm. "Tomorrow, Kane," Nathan said, already turning to write his report. "Just bring it back in the morning." The drive home was silent. The rain had returned, a cold, persistent drizzle that turned the main street of Osprey Point into a slick, neon-streaked mirror. Bandit, who had been waiting with anxious patience, now sat in the passenger seat, his head resting on the center console, his eyes fixed on Everett. The dog could sense the change in him. The man who had walked to the beach that morning was gone. This new man was tense, coiled, and smelled of old coffee and fresh anxiety. Everett's cabin was set back from the road, nestled deep in the pines. It was his fortress. Inside, it was the opposite of the nomad's chaotic ruin. It was meticulous, orderly, and spare. The books on his shelves were arranged by size. The tools by the cold fireplace were clean. His kitchen was spotless. It was the home of a man who maintained control by mastering his environment. He let Bandit out for a quick run, then fed him. The simple domestic rhythm was a comfort. The scrape of the metal scoop, the sound of the dog eating, the click of his nails on the hardwood floor. But the USB drive sat on the kitchen counter like a dark, silent accusation. After Bandit settled onto his rug by the now roaring wood stove, Everett poured a cup of black coffee, sat at his simple wooden desk, and turned on his laptop. He inserted the drive. For the first 2 hours, he was just a technician. He was Petty Officer Kane again. He bypassed the video logs and went straight to the blueprints, the wiring schematics, the power grid plans. And he was, in a word, astonished. He thought of everything, Everett murmured into the quiet room. Simon Caldwell's mind was a thing of genius. The power grid was triple redundant. The water filtration system could, in theory, be run manually, by solar, or by wind turbine. The load-bearing calculations for the hull, the stress diagrams for the welds. They were beautiful. They were perfect. Everett found himself nodding in respect. He understood this obsessive planning, this absolute unwavering faith in systems. He saw his own reflection in the lines of code. He, too, had been a man of systems. He thought back to his time in the Navy, specifically to 1999, on the bridge of the USS Donnelly. He had been in charge of integrating a new, perfect targeting system. His plan, his data, his models. They were flawless. He had presented them to the captain with absolute confidence. It was a perfect plan. And then, during a live-fire drill, in a sudden, unforecasted squall, it had all collapsed. A single, tiny variable he hadn't accounted for, a fractional delay in the data relay caused by the atmospheric electrical charge. His perfect plan. A cold knot tightened in Everett's stomach. He shook the memory away, focusing on the screen. He had clicked through almost all the technical files. Only one folder remained. Logs, final. It contained a single, corrupted video file, the one that had been just static at the station. Curious, Everett ran a simple video recovery program he kept for his own hobbies. The file was damaged, but not destroyed. The software worked, stitching together broken fragments of data. He clicked play. This was not a log. There was no introduction. The screen was black, then flickered to life. The view was from a camera mounted on the Nomad's bulkhead. The cabin was almost unrecognizable. It was dark, lit only by the frantic flashing red of emergency alarms on the dashboard. The sound was the first thing that hit Everett. A high-pitched, deafening roar, like a jet engine, mixed with the deep percussive boom of waves striking the hull. Simon Caldwell was visible, but he was not the calm, superior engineer from the earlier videos. He was soaked, his hair plastered to his skull. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was fighting with the steering column, which seemed to be dead. He slammed his fist against the dashboard, and for a second he looked at the screens, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending betrayal. "The models were wrong," he screamed, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. The steering system failed. The data was solid. He was weeping, his body shaking. It can't fail." As he said it, a sound tore through the audio, a high-pitched metallic shriek, the sound of metal tearing apart. It was the sound of the solar array, the sail that Everett had identified, being ripped from the roof. The Nomad lurched violently, throwing Simon against the bulkhead. The camera angle tilted, showing the black, boiling ocean through a port window. Then the wave hit. It wasn't a wave. It was a wall of water, a dark, moving mountain that blotted out the sky. It struck the vessel with a final, catastrophic sound, a deep, crushing impact that sounded like the world was ending. The screen went black. The audio feed cut to static. The video was over, but Everett Kane didn't move. He sat motionless, staring at the blank screen. The roaring sound hadn't stopped. It was still in his ears. The high, metallic shriek. He was cold. So cold. The room was freezing, though the fire was roaring just feet away. He wasn't in his cabin. He was on the bridge of the Donnelly in 1999. The same shriek, the same sound of a system failing, the same red emergency lights flashing. He could smell the ozone from a shorted-out panel. His perfect plan, his flawless data. "It can't fail," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He was looking at the laptop, but he was seeing Simon's face. Only it was his own. The same betrayal, the same failure. Simon's failure was his failure. He was the man who trusted the data. He was the man who built the coffin. He couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, too heavy. He tried to take a breath, but his chest wouldn't expand. He was drowning, 2 miles from shore, in his own cabin. He gripped the edges of the desk, his knuckles white, as the cabin began to spin, the sound of the wind and the tearing metal filling the world. A soft, anxious whine cut through the noise. It was a sound that didn't belong on the bridge. It came from the floor. Bandit was awake. He had been asleep by the fire, but the sudden stillness of his owner, the sharp new scent of cold sweat and fear, had jolted him awake. He was on his feet, standing beside the chair, whining deep in his chest. Everett didn't respond. He was staring, locked in the past. Bandit nudged his head under Everett's rigid hand. Nothing. The dog whined again, louder this time, a sound of profound canine worry. He backed up, then pushed forward, jamming his cold, wet nose hard into Everett's armpit, a jarring, physical shock. Still nothing. Bandit knew this man. He knew his sounds, his smells. This was wrong. This was the smell that came with the nightmares, but this time, the man's eyes were open. The big German shepherd didn't hesitate. He reared up, placing his 2 front paws on Everett's thighs. He was an 80-pound dog, a solid, living weight. He pushed, trying to climb. Everett gasped, a small, choked sound, as the dog's weight broke his paralysis. Bandit took the opening. He scrambled, awkward but deliberate, forcing his way onto Everett's lap, a maneuver they hadn't done since he was a puppy. He couldn't fit, but he didn't care. He jammed his body against Everett's chest, a solid, warm, breathing ballast. He pushed his head under Everett's chin, forcing the man's gaze away from the screen, and applied steady, heavy pressure. He whined, softly, deep in his throat. The physical sensations broke the spell. The weight, the warmth, the rhythmic, steady breathing of the dog against his own erratic, pounding heart. The smell of clean fur, not of salt and ozone. Everett's vision cleared. The roaring in his ears faded, replaced by the sound of Bandit's breathing and the gentle crackle of the wood stove. A shudder ran through Everett's entire body, a single, violent convulsion. He let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 26 years. Slowly, his trembling hand came up. He buried his fingers in the thick gray and white ruff of Bandit's neck, gripping the dog like a drowning man holds a life raft. "Bandit," he whispered, his voice cracking. The dog whined, a soft sound of confirmation, and licked the salty tear track from Everett's rough, unshaven cheek. Everett closed his eyes, turned his face, and buried it in the dog's fur, holding on as the last echoes of the storm finally, mercifully, receded. Everett Kane's world returned to him in agonizingly slow increments. First, the sound. The roaring wind and tearing metal in his memory finally gave way to the steady, rhythmic breathing of the animal pressed against his chest. Next, the smell. The phantom scent of ozone and salt water was replaced by the familiar, dusty warmth of Bandit's fur and the faint, comforting smoke from the wood stove. Finally, sensation. The crushing weight on his chest was not the ocean, but the heavy, grounding pressure of his dog. His hands, which he'd thought were gripping a failing console, were fisted deep in Bandit's ruff. He was on the floor of his cabin. He wasn't on the bridge of the Donnelly. He wasn't on the Nomad. He was home. He let out a ragged, shuddering breath that was half a sob. Bandit, sensing the shift, whined softly and licked his chin. "Good boy," Everett whispered, his voice a raw, broken rasp. "Good boy, I'm here." He lay there for several long minutes, the 80-pound German Shepherd acting as an anchor to the present. The attack had passed, leaving him exhausted, hollowed out, and soaked in a cold sweat. But beneath the exhaustion, a different emotion was surfacing, a cold, hard anger. He had allowed himself to be a victim, to be dragged back to 1999 by a ghost on a video file. He had let his failure define him, just as Simon Caldwell had let his data define him. Slowly, almost painfully, he moved Bandit's heavy paws off his chest and sat up. The dog didn't move away, but sat pressed against his side, a silent gray and white guardian, watching his every move with anxious eyes. "It's okay," Everett said, more to himself than the dog. "I'm okay." He looked at the laptop on the desk. The screen was black, the video having long since finished. He couldn't leave it. He couldn't go to Sheriff Nathan in the morning and say, "I couldn't finish." He couldn't let the ghost win. He had watched that video as a victim. Now he needed to watch it as a sailor. He needed to watch it as an analyst. He stood on shaky legs and went to the sink, splashing icy water on his face. He dried himself with a rough towel, the abrasive texture a welcome, painful reality. He walked back to the desk, his boots heavy on the floor. Bandit followed, sitting at his feet, his chin resting on Everett's boot. "I have to see it again, boy," he murmured. "I have to see it." He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and sat down. He positioned the cursor and hit play. The file opened. This time, Everett didn't look away. He forced himself to watch. The video began. The summary he had built in his mind during the attack was correct, but the reality was infinitely worse. It was a scene of pure, chaotic hell. The camera was mounted to a bulkhead, but it was tilted at a sickening 30-degree angle. The only light came from the bank of Simon Caldwell's custom-built dashboard, which was now a flashing, screaming cacophony of red and amber emergency lights. The sound, which his speakers had barely been able to reproduce, was overwhelming. It was a constant, high-pitched roar. Wind, he realized, screaming through a breach. And beneath that, the steady, catastrophic, percussive boom of waves striking the hull. It was the sound of a drum being beaten with a sledgehammer, a rhythm of pure destruction. For the first 30 seconds, that was all there was. The alarms, the roar, the terrible, lurching tilt of the cabin. Everett found himself scanning the screen, his old training taking over. He's in a trough, Everett thought, his mind becoming cold and analytical. The boat is wallowing, not climbing the waves. He's lost all propulsion. He's dead in the water. Then Simon Caldwell entered the frame, or rather, was thrown into it. He wasn't the confident, bright-eyed engineer from the earlier logs. He was a wraith, soaked to the bone, his thin hair plastered to his skull. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a kind of frenetic, shocked energy. He wasn't wearing an immersion suit. He wasn't wearing a life vest. He wasn't at a radio sending a mayday. He was at his dashboard. He slammed his open palm against a screen that had gone dark. No, 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 no. He tried to grab the steering column, a useless piece of metal now, and wrestled with it. It was clearly disconnected, floppy in his hands. And then he looked up, as if just realizing the camera was there, or perhaps seeing his own reflection in its dark lens. He wasn't speaking to a future rescuer. He was speaking to the system that had betrayed him. "The steering system failed," he screamed, his voice a thin, reedy sound against the storm's roar. He pointed a shaking finger at the console. "The primary, the secondary, the manual override, all failed." He was weeping now, but they were not tears of sadness. It was the hot, frustrated rage of a believer whose deity has just been proven false. "The models were wrong! They were all wrong!" He staggered back, bracing himself as the Nomad dropped sickeningly into another trough. He's not fighting the storm, Everett thought, his heart aching with a terrible, cold pity. He's arguing with it. He's still trying to win the argument. "The data was solid," Simon shrieked, his face contorted. "I checked it. I ran the simulations 1,000 times. 1,000 times. The tolerances were clear." He was clinging to the bulkhead, staring at his failing screens as if he could fix them with his willpower alone. It cannot fail. And as he spoke the last word, the sound that Everett had heard in his flashback tore through the speakers. It was a high-pitched, metallic shriek, a sound of extraordinary violence. Everett flinched, even though he knew it was coming. There it is, the solar array, the windage. The cabin, already tilted, lurched with an impossible, sudden violence. Simon Caldwell was thrown from his feet, tumbling across the cabin and striking the far wall. He didn't get up. He was dazed, perhaps injured. The camera angle was now pointed almost straight down at the floor, which was shimmering with seawater. And then, through the port window, Everett saw it. For a brief second, the window, which had been showing only black, chaotic water, was filled with a wall of white. It was foam, the crest of a wave so large it defied belief. The rogue wave, Everett thought, the statistical anomaly. Simon Caldwell, bleeding from a cut on his head, looked up. He saw the white water filling the window. For the first time, the rage in his eyes was replaced by a simple, childlike expression of pure, uncomprehending awe. He understood in that final second that the ocean was not a data set. The window didn't just break. It imploded. The last thing the video recorded was a sound of a massive, deafening crash. A final concussive boom as the wall of water struck the Nomad with the force of a freight train. The screen filled with a chaotic boiling surge of white and black, and then, instantly, it was silent. The file cut to black. The video was over. Everett sat back in his chair, the cabin silent save for the crackle of the fire. His heart was pounding, but his breathing was steady. The panic was gone. The cold sweats were gone. He had seen it. He had faced it. He looked down. Bandit was still there, his head on Everett's boot, his brown eyes looking up at him, a silent, unwavering question. "Are you okay?" Everett reached down and scrubbed the dog's head, his hand rough but gentle. "Yeah, boy," he whispered. "I'm okay now." He felt a profound, bottomless sadness, but it was a clean sadness, not the jagged, confusing terror of his PTSD. He was sad for Simon Caldwell, the brilliant, naive man who had built a perfect fortress, only to forget to build a door for the ocean to get out. He had seen a man's last, terrible moments, a man who, in a different life, could have been him. Everett Kane did not sleep. He sat in his dark cabin until the first watery gray light of dawn filtered through the pines. The laptop on his desk was closed, but the images from the final video were burned onto his mind. The roar of the storm, the shriek of tearing metal, and the look of utter betrayed disbelief on Simon Caldwell's face. Bandit, sensing the profound shift in the night, had not returned to his own bed by the fire. He had stayed close, his body pressed against Everett's leg, a silent, warm, living presence in a room filled with ghosts. When the clock on the wall read 6 a.m., Everett stood. His joints ached. He was exhausted, but it was a wired, vibrating exhaustion. He was haunted. He looked at the USB drive on his desk. He had to return it to Sheriff Nathan. But that was an excuse. He was being pulled back to the harbor, back to the Nomad. The final video, in its terrible finality, hadn't closed the loop. It had opened a new one. A man like Simon Caldwell, a man who planned everything, from his power grid to his water filtration, right down to the obsessive, precise block lettering in his logbook, would not have let his life's work end with a scream and a corrupted file. He was a man who trusted systems. He would have created a final, fail-safe system for his legacy. Everett had seen Simon's failure. Now he felt an urgent, inexplicable need to find his epitaph. "Come on, boy," Everett whispered, his voice a rough rasp. Bandit was on his feet in an instant. The harbor at dawn was a graveyard of mist. The Nomad sat on the dock like a dark, beached whale, its perimeter tape fluttering in the damp breeze. It looked smaller, sadder, and infinitely more tragic. Sheriff Nathan's SUV was already there. He was standing by the wreck, holding a steaming styrofoam cup, looking at the vessel with an expression of pure, bureaucratic dread. "You're here early, Kane," Nathan said, not sounding surprised. Everett walked up, Bandit heeling perfectly at his side. He held out the USB drive. "You wanted this back?" Nathan took it, weighing it in his hand. "You see the rest of it?" "I saw the last file," Everett said. The two words hung in the cold air between them. Nathan nodded, his gaze dropping. "Yeah, tough stuff. So that's that. A brilliant man who built a bad boat. A tragedy?" Everett looked at the wreck, at the hull he had seen in the blueprints, at the strong, clean welds. "No, Sheriff. He built a fortress. He just didn't know how to sail it." He paused. "I need to go back inside." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "For what? There's nothing left but rust and mildew." "I don't know. A serial number. A manufacturer's plate. Something." Everett's voice was quiet but insistent. "A man this obsessive, he wouldn't just let it all disappear. He would have left something permanent, something that doesn't need a hard drive, something that doesn't wash away." Nathan studied the veteran's face. He saw the haunted look, the sleepless night, but also the sharp analytical focus that had been missing for years. "All right, Kane, but I'm not responsible if you fall through that rotted floor." Everett left Bandit tied to the rail of the dock where the dog could see him. "Stay," he ordered. Bandit sat, his eyes wide and worried, watching his owner disappear back into the dark, hollowed-out wreck. Everett bypassed the main cabin, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The stench of mildew was weaker now, overpowered by the cold, clean salt air. He went straight to the small, cramped hatch that led to the engine compartment. The space was a disaster. The engine, a hybrid of diesel and electric according to the blueprints, was a single, fused block of bright orange rust. A greasy, rainbow-sheened layer of water sloshed on the floor. This was a place of total failure. He scanned the bulkheads with his flashlight, his old Navy training kicking in. He was looking for anomalies, for anything that was not part of the standard, corroded landscape. He checked the main engine block, the mounts, the fuel tanks. Nothing but rust and decay. He was about to turn back, a cold sense of disappointment settling over him. He had been wrong. Simon had just been a man, after all. A man who failed and died, leaving nothing but a digital scream. But he hid the USB drive, Everett thought, a sudden, sharp clarity cutting through his fatigue. He hid it behind a panel. He plans for failure. Where would he put his final message? Not in the cabin, where it could be destroyed by a wave, not on the dashboard. He'd put it somewhere permanent, somewhere structural. Everett moved his flashlight beam away from the machinery and onto the bones of the ship itself, the massive, reinforced I-beam that served as the vessel's spine. He followed it with the light, moving deeper into the cramped, oily darkness. He almost missed it. Tucked behind a nest of corroded hydraulic lines, bolted not just with 2 screws, but with 4, was a small stainless steel plate. It was not painted. It had not corroded. It was about the size of a postcard. Everett's heart hammered against his ribs. He shoved the hydraulic lines aside. The plate was covered in a thick film of grease. He wiped it away with his glove. It was not a serial number. The plate had been etched, the letters cut deep and clean into the metal with a skill that was surgical. It was the same precise mechanical font from the logbook. He read the words, his flashlight beam trembling. "I, Simon Caldwell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my final testament." Everett's breath caught in his throat. The vessel, nomad, and all intellectual and physical property associated with it, is a failed prototype. But the dream is not, is. I am a failed engineer, but the ideal is sound. Therefore, I bequeath this vessel, in whatever state it is found, to whoever finds it. It is a gift, with one condition, that it be used to help the others, the ones left behind, the nomads of the land, the homeless, the forgotten, the ones the system failed. Sell it, study it, scrap it, but use whatever value it has to give a hand to those with nothing, Don't let this dream die. Everett Kane leaned his head against the cold, damp bulkhead. He didn't realize he was crying until he felt the hot track of a tear on his cold cheek. This wasn't a suicide note. It was a message in a bottle, etched in steel. It wasn't a story of failure. It was a story of hope. He emerged from the hatch, blinking in the gray morning light. He was covered in grease, his hands shaking. Sheriff Nathan looked up, his coffee halfway to his lips. "You look like you saw a ghost, Kane." "I found his epitaph, Sheriff," Everett said, his voice raw. "And you were right. The paperwork just got a whole lot worse." By noon, the story was out of Nathan's hands. He had photographed the plate. He had made his report. He had, as required, released the information to the tiny Osprey Point Gazette, expecting a small, bizarre local interest story. The Gazette's part-time reporter, a young woman named Sarah, wrote the article. Ghost Ship's Bizarre Will, a Dying Wish for the Homeless. It posted to their website at 1 p.m. At 2:30 p.m., a board Associated Press stringer in Portland, scanning local Oregon news feeds, saw the headline. He read the story. He read the text of the will. He saw the name Simon Caldwell. He made one phone call. By 4 p.m., the story was on the national AP wire. By 5 p.m., Sheriff Nathan's phone was ringing. It was not a local number. It was a producer from a major cable news network in Atlanta. Everett was at home, sitting on his porch, watching Bandit chase a seagull. His phone, which he rarely used, vibrated in his pocket. It was Nathan. "You'd better turn on your TV, Kane." The sheriff's voice was strained. "Channel 5. And, don't answer your door." Everett went inside, flicked on the small television, and sat down. The screen was filled with a high-definition, dramatic graphic, Mystery of the Deep, the Genius's Ghost Ship. A polished anchor was speaking. The incredible final wish of vanished tech millionaire Simon Caldwell. A will etched in steel, found by a local veteran. The story is capturing the hearts of the nation. The screen flashed to a grainy photo of the Nomad, then to the crisp, clear photo Nathan had taken of the steel plate. The story was no longer about a wreck. It was about a legend. It had gone viral. The news story did not just go viral. It exploded. It had all the elements of a modern legend, a vanished genius, a tragic past, a mysterious ghost ship, and a final poetic message of charity. Simon Caldwell and the Nomad's Will became trending topics. The small, blurry photo of Everett Kane, which the local paper had on file, was suddenly next to high-resolution images of Simon Caldwell on screens across the world. But in Osprey Point, Oregon, the story was a storm, a siege of satellite trucks and ringing phones. For Everett, it was a nightmare. He had unplugged his landline and put a chain across his driveway. He and Bandit were prisoners in their own fortress, the world's noise pressing in from all sides. Meanwhile, 900 miles south, in a different world entirely, a nurse was taking her 3 hours a.m. break. Ensenada, Baja California, Mexico, was not a place of cold fogs and quiet pines. It was a bustling port city, alive even in the small hours with the sounds of motors, music, and the sea. The break room at the Hospital General was a small, windowless closet that smelled of burnt coffee and harsh antiseptic cleaning solutions. Elena Ramirez, a registered nurse on the night shift, sat heavily on a worn plastic chair, her feet aching. She was a woman in her 450s, with kind, tired eyes and a pragmatism that came from 2 decades of seeing everything. She was scrolling through her phone, not for news, but for a simple, mindless distraction. Cat videos, pictures from her sister in Guadalajara. Anything to clear her head before she had to face the chaos of the emergency ward again. Her thumb paused on a shared link from a cousin in Los Angeles. The headline was in English, but it was the photo that caught her. Genius's Ghost Ship, a Final Wish. She tapped it. She read the story about the reclusive veteran in Oregon, the bizarre boat, the steel plate, and the engineer named Simon Caldwell, who had vanished 5 years ago. She scrolled back up to the main photo. It was a professional headshot, clearly from Simon Caldwell's tech mogul days. He looked thin, intense, and impeccably dressed, his eyes burning with a fierce, focused intelligence. Elena Ramirez put her phone down on the table. Her coffee sat untouched. "No," she whispered, her voice a breath. "It can't be." She looked at the photo again. The name Simon Caldwell meant nothing to her. The man in the suit meant nothing to her. But the eyes. She had seen those eyes. She closed her own, and the memory returned, sharp and clear. It was from, yes, late spring, about 6 months ago. A call had come in, a medical emergency from a cargo ship entering the harbor. The ship was the Estrella de Panama, a Panamanian-flagged container vessel. They had a survivor. The man they brought in had not been a man. He had been a skeleton. Elena had been the admitting nurse, and she would never forget it. He was suffering from profound hypothermia, severe dehydration, and malnutrition. He was covered in saltwater sores. His beard was matted, his hair bleached by the sun, his lips cracked and black. He had been rescued from a life raft, the cargo ship's captain explained, spotted by pure chance, alone in the vast empty Pacific. He had no papers, no wallet, no name. They had called him Juan Sin Nombre, John Doe. In the hospital, he was a puzzle. He refused to speak. Or, more accurately, he seemed unable to speak, as if the words were trapped, his trauma too deep. He was shell-shocked. For the first week, he just stared, his eyes wide and hollow. But he wasn't the man in the photo. The man in the photo was confident, powerful. Her patient had been broken, terrified, and as light as a child. So why did her heart feel like it was beating in her throat? She pulled the article back up, her hands shaking slightly. She read it again, this time slower. A brilliant engineer, obsessed with systems, blamed society for a personal tragedy. Elena's blood ran cold. She remembered. Her John Doe hadn't just been silent. He had been strange. After he regained some strength, she remembered finding him staring at his own IV drip. He wasn't looking at the needle. He was looking at the plastic valve, the way the drops were regulated. His expression wasn't pain. It was, she realized now, it was contempt. She had watched him one afternoon just before his discharge as he sat by the window. A new automated blood pressure cuff had malfunctioned on another patient. Juan had watched the nurses struggle with it, and a sound had come out of him, a dry, rasping noise that was almost a laugh, but held no humor. It was a sound of pure, bitter confirmation. He wasn't just traumatized, he was ashamed. "Elena, your break is over." Her colleague stood in the doorway. "1 minute, Maria," Elena said. She stood, her mind racing. This was insane. But what if it wasn't? She went to a computer terminal and logged into the hospital's old, slow database. She searched for admissions for John Doe for the date. It took her 10 minutes, but she found the file. Admitted, May 14th. Patient, John Doe. Rescued by cargo vessel Estrella de Panama. Condition, malnutrition, exposure. She clicked to the last page of the file. Diagnosis, profound post-traumatic stress. Discharged to Municipal Social Services, June 3rd. She knew what that meant. He had been given clothes and a small amount of money and sent to a local shelter. She went back to her phone. She looked at the intense, burning eyes of Simon Caldwell, the genius engineer. Then she looked at the photo she had taken of her John Doe, a quick, unauthorized photo for her own files in case his family ever came looking. The man in her photo was a hollow-eyed ghost, but the eyes were the same. The fire had burned out, but the shape of the fireplace was identical. My goodness," she whispered. This was not a newspaper story. This was a man who was lost, not dead. She knew this was a breach of protocol, but she didn't care. She found the contact page for the Osprey Point Gazette mentioned in the article. It listed a number. It was 3:30 a.m. in Oregon. She dialed it. It went to a tinny-sounding voicemail. She hung up, frustrated. She tried the sheriff's department. It was a non-emergency number. She knew it would just ring, but she had to try. A sleepy, confused voice answered. Osprey Point Dispatch. My name is Elena Ramirez, she said, her Spanish-accented English suddenly feeling thick and clumsy. I am a nurse in Ensenada, in Mexico. I am calling about your ghost ship, the man, Simon Caldwell. There was a heavy sigh on the other end, as if the dispatcher had heard this a dozen times tonight. Ma'am, we are not taking statements on that. It's an ongoing— He is not dead, Elena said, her voice sharp, the authority of a night shift nurse cutting through the line. I treated him. In May, he was rescued from a life raft. He is alive. The line went utterly silent. Ma'am, the dispatcher's voice was different now, awake. You stay on the line. I'm putting you through to the sheriff. Right now. The truth was, Simon Caldwell was alive. He had survived the storm. He had deployed the life raft his data had told him was a statistical redundancy. He had been rescued. And after weeks in a Mexican hospital, terrified that the world would discover his failure, his shame overwhelming him, he had done the only logical thing a man like him could do. He had taken the charity of the hospital, walked out of the shelter, and blended into the mainland. He had willingly disappeared into the one system he had never been part of, becoming just another face in the crowd, another nomad on the land. The news that Simon Caldwell was alive had thrown the town of Osprey Point into a new kind of chaos. The national media descended again, this time with a new, baffling narrative. But Simon, having disappeared from the Mexican hospital, was now a ghost in a different way, leaving the town with a legal and logistical nightmare. The Nomad was an impounded, abandoned, and hazardous piece of property. It was an attractive nuisance, and the town's insurance carrier was threatening to drop their policy. The solution for everyone on the town council was simple: sell it for scrap. The meeting was held on a Tuesday night in the high school gymnasium, the only place large enough to hold the crowd of curious locals, angry fishermen, and opportunistic media. The air smelled of old varnish, stale coffee, and damp wool. The item on the agenda was disposition of derelict vessel, 5881, the Nomad. The motion is on the floor to accept the bid from Pacific Metals for $5,000, to have the vessel removed and scrapped. The mayor, a tired-looking woman named Alice, said. I second that, a voice boomed from the crowd. A man stood and the crowd quieted. This was Garrett Lane. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same driftwood that washed up on their shores. He was the unspoken leader of the fishing fleet, a man of pure, uncompromising pragmatism. Let's just be done with it, Garrett said, his voice a low rumble that easily filled the gym. It's scrap metal. It's an eyesore, it's dangerous, and it's costing this town money every day it sits on our dock. This will, he wrote. The man's alive. He abandoned it. It's not a poetic treasure, it's garbage. Let's take the $5,000 and fix the potholes on Harbor Drive. A solid round of applause and hears followed. This was the voice of reason. This was the logical end. If there's no further discussion, the mayor began, her gavel raised. Wait. The voice was quiet, rough from disuse, but it cut through the room. Every head in the gymnasium turned. In the back doorway, standing in the harsh yellow light, was Everett Kane. He hadn't just come to the meeting. He had brought his dog. Bandit, his gray and white fur almost glowing, walked calmly at Everett's left heel. He wore a simple, black harness that identified him as a service animal, the legal key that had allowed them entry. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The town recluse, the veteran who found the boat. Everett Kane felt like his skin was on fire. The noise, the lights, the eyes. It was all a physical weight, pressing down on him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He wanted to turn, to run back to the safety of his cabin, to the quiet of the pines. Then he felt a gentle, warm pressure against his leg. Bandit, sensing the spike in his owner's anxiety, leaned against him, a simple physical reminder. I am here. Everett put his hand on the dog's head. Bandit's breathing was slow, even, and calm. The dog's absolute confidence in him was an anchor. Everett took a breath, held it, and let it out. He forced his gaze away from the crowd and looked at Garrett Lane. It's my final test, the summary had said. This was it. Mr. Kane, the mayor said, her voice laced with surprise. Do you wish to speak? Everett nodded, his throat dry. He walked, not to the podium, but to the center of the aisle, Bandit moving in perfect time with him. He stopped, his old leather jacket looking out of place among the nylon parkas of the fishermen. He looked at Garrett Lane. You're right, Garrett. His voice was a low rasp. It's scrap metal. It's a failure. It's a waste of money. Garrett Lane crossed his arms, his expression saying, Then sit down. But I was thinking, Everett continued, his hand never leaving Bandit's head. We're a town full of people who know about failure. Every man in this room who's ever owned a boat, we've all had it happen. He was speaking to the fishermen now, his true audience. We know what it's like to check the charts, check the engine, check the weather, to have a perfect plan, and then the ocean. The ocean does what it wants. A rogue wave, a hidden line, a sudden squall. And that perfect plan, that expensive engine, it fails, it breaks, it becomes scrap. The gym was utterly silent. I saw his files, Everett said, his voice gaining a pained strength. Simon Caldwell, he was a genius. He had a perfect plan. He had data for everything, but he didn't know the ocean. He didn't know what we know, that the ocean doesn't care about your plans, that failure isn't a possibility, it's a guarantee. He looked at the mayor. He built a fortress to keep the world out, and it became his coffin. I know what that's like. He paused, and the confession hung in the air, raw and undisputed. But then, I found that plate, that will, and he said, Don't let this dream die. He asked us to help the nomads, the ones left behind. I look around this town, and I see our kids sitting on the curb with nothing to do. I see them getting left behind. They're the nomads. He pointed a finger, not at the council, but toward the harbor. That boat is scrap, but that hull, that framework, it's a fortress. Simon was right about that. It survived a journey none of us could. It's strong. So, let's not sell it. Let's use it. Let's pull that hull onto the land, bolt it to the ground, and build a workshop inside it. A place where our kids, where Leo, where all those teenagers can learn to weld, to fix an engine, to build something with their hands, instead of just waiting. He finished, his breath coming in gasps, his body trembling from the exertion. The mayor looked stunned. Sheriff Nathan, in the back, just smiled into his hand. Garrett Lane was the first to speak. His face was unreadable. A workshop, Kane? Who's paying for that? Who's going to run it? You? The man who hasn't spoken to this town in 10 years? The challenge was sharp, brutal, and fair. Everett met his gaze. The old Everett would have flinched, retreated. The new Everett, with Bandit at his side, stood his ground. Yes, he said, his voice clear. Me? A deep, profound silence filled the gym. Garrett Lane stared at Everett for a long 10-second count. He looked at the man, this ghost, who had just offered his whole self to a room of strangers. He looked at the dog, calm and steady as a rock. Garrett Lane let out a long, slow breath. He uncrossed his arms. Mr. Mayor, Garrett said, his voice softer now, I withdraw my second. He turned and looked at Everett. He didn't smile, but he gave a single, sharp nod, the nod of a man who had just been beaten in an argument he was glad to lose. I make a new motion, Garrett Lane said, that we table the sale and form an exploratory committee to build the damn workshop, and I'll be the first to volunteer. 6 months later, the sun was shining. The Oregon coast, so often gray and moody, was a brilliant, sparkling blue. The Nomad, or what was left of it, sat on a concrete pad near the harbor, its bizarre, Airstream-like shape now the front of a brand-new functional workshop. The sound of a power wrench echoed from inside, mixed with the sound of a teenage boy's laughter. Inside, Everett Kane, his sleeves rolled up, was leaning over a small, disassembled outboard motor. His brown hair, now neatly trimmed, still had its silver streaks, but his face was animated. "No, Leo, you're torquing it too hard," he was saying, his voice patient. "Let the tool do the work, like this. See?" Leo, a lanky 15-year-old in a grease-stained shirt, nodded, his eyes wide with focus. "Oh, okay, I get it." Everett was no longer a recluse. He was a teacher. He was the most sought-after man in town, the gruff but fair head of the Osprey Point Youth Workshop. He stepped back and wiped his hands on a rag, looking at the organized, clean, vibrant space, all built around the silver skeleton of Simon Caldwell's failed dream. He walked to the large, open bay door, squinting in the bright sunlight. He looked for his anchor, and he found him. Bandit, his gray and white fur brilliant in the sun, was lying on a patch of warm grass just outside the workshop. He wasn't watching the door. He wasn't on duty. He was sprawled on his side, his legs twitching occasionally, deep in a peaceful, contented sleep. His job, for now, wonderfully and completely done. The story of Everett and Bandit is a quiet reminder that our greatest failures are often just the raw materials for our redemption. It shows us that in the midst of any storm, the steady, grounding presence of a loyal heart can guide us back to shore, back to ourselves. If this story of hope found in the wreckage touched you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need it. We find great comfort in reading your comments and learning how these tales resonate with your own lives. Your likes and your decision to subscribe are what allow us to continue this journey together. We hope you'll stay with us for the next story, which is waiting for you right now on the screen.